Okay, next we have Sarah Rosenthal. I first had the pleasure of working with Sarah in our X Stories reading, and since then she's. Okay, that's fine. You're fine. You're fine. Sorry, guys. Okay. Since then, she signed up for the Works in Progress workshop, and we got to know each other very intimately. So I'm a really big fan of her writing. I'm so glad you guys are going to get to hear her story. Her bio is Sarah Rosenthal works in advertising by day and writes nonfiction and poetry by night. She runs a blog called Let's Eat Our Feelings, and her work has been featured in Splice Lit and I Want You to See This Before I Leave zine, where she was the featured author in the December 2014 issue. When she's not writing, she can be found cooking, baking, knitting, and binge watching. She lives in Brooklyn. Let's give it up for Sarah.
Hey. Okay, so my piece is called The Alphabet City Vortex. I was just a few months out of college when I got my first job in New York City as an editorial assistant at a big publishing house. From the from the time I first learned to talk, which was basically straight out of the womb, I had said I would move to the city, entrench myself with the effortlessly cool artists and moody, talented writers I'd always admired. I imagined myself tucked away into a lovely little apartment, not too big and not too small, in a neighborhood with the name Village in the title, or with initials like Soho, NoHo, Nolita, Tribeca. It would be like Sex in the City, but slightly grittier, like Girls but not insufferable, like Patti Smith's Just Kids but contemporary and with less Robert Mapplethorpe. But the search to find the perfect place was not as smooth and fluid and serendipitous as I'd thought, like all the best stories I'd heard of finding real estate in the city. With the new job came nights of diving deep into the dirty pit of Craigslist while still living at my parents' house on the Connecticut shoreline, trying to find an apartment that was affordable, didn't have excessive typos in the listing, looked completely filthy, or seemed far too good to be true. The apartment I landed in was on Avenue C, like a different planet from anywhere I'd ever lived. It was a dark, odd space, artsy but a little lopsided, trying to be cozy but too cramped to be a home. Every room was painted dark, muddied colors, and my roommates' giant tapestries were draped down the walls. All of the surfaces in the kitchen and bathroom were slightly warped, didn't quite fit. The walls were fake, imposter structures to keep me segmented away from my roommates. I found dead cockroaches abandoned at the back of the kitchen cabinets, one almost completely fossilized in ancient spilled maple syrup. The apartment was a 20-minute walk to the nearest subway, and it sat above a Serbian bar and restaurant, where the live music started at 12:30 at night on weekdays, the singing and stomping feverishly loud. Peering down the fire escape outside my window, everyone looked too vibrant, too colorful, like fictional city dwellers sprung alive from a picture book. Immigrant families, rich-looking couples on dates, and NYU or New School students, snippets of their philosophical conversations wafting up the breeze to my window. Alphabet City was also nice, but not what I had envisioned. Nothing like what I'd read about in Allen Ginsberg poems or watched in Rent. The ginkgo tree outside my window made the sidewalk smell like week-old vomit. I introduced myself to the lady behind the counter at the bodega next door and told her I lived upstairs, and she just went on sipping her Red Bull and watching her telenovela, ignoring me. I wasn't sure what I expected from this neighborhood, art and writing and poetry and people my age everywhere surrounding me, my old college campus extended, but I was determined to make this place I'd come to land some form of place I might truly belong. 3 weeks into making New York City my home, I woke up to my mother's desperate phone call, saying Mayor Bloomberg was shutting down the subways, Hurricane Sandy was going to be far worse than we had thought, and I should really be watching the news. My parents were being evacuated as well, forced to stay with friends on higher ground. Mayor Bloomberg shared the screen with a map of the island of Manhattan, cordoned into several severe-looking shapes and colors. Everything on screen was red and screaming, "Get out, get out, get out." Upon closer inspection, the red parts of the map framed the slim, tapered island, awfully close to where I lived. When the newscast zoomed in further, it was on my neighborhood, Alphabet City, the radiating grid bursting forth from Tompkins Square Park. Everything was yellow or red except for Avenue C, my street, which had been casually split down the middle, both yellow and red. It appears the city of New York couldn't decide. Did Avenue C stand a chance when Hurricane Sandy, like a bruiser of a bully charging at me from down the hall, hurled herself at the city? No one seemed to know. My new neighborhood was ejecting me. Both my roommates bowed out swiftly to their respective partners' apartments in Brooklyn, leaving me all alone. "Stay safe," they texted to me, while I desperately contacted friends in northern Manhattan, which was colored a prim, bright, happy green on the news map, asking if someone had a place for me to crash, just for a day or two. My friends Renee and Sarah lived together and were the first to write back enthusiastically. "Stay with us," and "let's eat carbs and watch the X-Files," their texts read. Renee is in the audience. Thanks, Renee. I appreciate it. With that, I packed up all the food I could carry, enough clothes for 2 or 3 days max, a couple of tea candles I had laying around, a flashlight, and a light jacket, and made my way up the Manhattan grid line, the city growing grayer and darker by the minute. Renee and Sarah lived on a quiet block in Spanish Harlem across from a basketball court, 92 blocks from my place, the other edge of the Manhattan universe. We rode the storm out from the comfort of their beds, nestled in Renee's puffy white blankets, watching horror movies and the X-Files while living on homemade mac and cheese and leftover cake Sarah had salvaged from her bakery job. When it became clear that Sandy was going to be even worse than anticipated, the three of us huddled like witches over our Twitter feeds, News Channel 12 mumbling in the background with warnings of the apocalypse. There were photos circulating of my block on Avenue C, flooded with 5 feet of water, cop cars bobbing like fishing lures outside the police precinct. Our party atmosphere died down when it became clear this wasn't just a bigger, windier rainstorm. Down the block, we heard car alarms starting to go off and neighbors yelling. We crawled out the fire escape to see the Hudson River rising up 100th Street, slowly licking parked cars, the alarms wailing in agony from unexpected water damage. The city was gray, submerged, and quietly drowning. My parents texted me from Connecticut until their friends' power went out. The National Guard had been called in, friends' homes had been washed away, and they didn't know the extent of the damage to our house yet. That can't be right, I thought. My hometown is not one of those hometowns you see washed away on the news in big storms. But sure enough, there was footage of wrecked homes and massive floods broadcast on the nightly news. All of the fun was sucked out of the sleepover, my stomach as anxious as a flag in the wind. Renee, Sarah, and I gathered candles and flashlights around us like we were readying for a seance, to bring back the ghost of something we realized we'd lose when the city was flooded, trying to stay afloat after being thrown into the deep end of a hurricane we weren't ready for. With a kind of hushed dread and thrumming excitement that can only come with the inevitable, we waited to lose electricity, but we never did. Once the water receded and Sandy wore herself out, the streets were covered in debris. I had been at my friend's apartment for longer than I had expected and needed to check on my own apartment. Horror stories were rising from the lower half of Manhattan, still without power. Some buildings already had mold growing. There were people unaccounted for, hints of potential looting. The subways were down, but when taxis began to run again, I tried to catch one hurtling downtown. "You want to go where?" the cab driver spat at me. "Avenue C and 8th, please," I repeated. "Why would you want to go there right now?" "I live there." He shook his head and drove. I shared the cab with the woman who had an immaculate updo and makeup running down her face. "I'm getting married today," she whimpered, "and no one can make it. Everyone is stuck outside the city, even my parents, and I'm getting married, and I don't know what to do." "It'll be a wonderful day," I told her, my optimism refusing to die. "It will. Maybe one day you can do over the ceremony when the weather is better and everyone can attend." "You can't really get a do-over for these sorts of things," she told me, a river of black mascara streaming down her face. We got to her stop, somewhere along East 42nd Street. But here I go. After she got out, we sped down the quiet, listless, defeated southern half of the island, lost without power, no one in the streets, everything too quiet and too dirty, even for New York. It didn't feel right, wasn't quite what it ought to be. The further east we ventured, the dirtier, quieter, and sadder it became. Peering out the cab window, the only people I could see were poking out of basements, stuck in the coils of generators and sump pumps, throwing drenched, ruined objects to the curb. A wet, moldy smell crept into the cab. Oh God, what have I done? Why would I ever move to this place? I thought, my stomach turning to asphalt. The cab spat me out at the corner. The ginkgo-infused sidewalk I'd just gotten used to walking along was nearly covered with trash, river debris, ruined groceries from the bodega, nearly disintegrated artifacts from basements all up and down the block. My building looked fine from the outside, but the electric lock had fizzled out and the front door stood ajar. When I got inside, the lobby had a water stain almost as tall as me and smelled like algae. The first floor tenant, a guy in his 30s, was fighting to open his door because his wood floors were too warped. I walked up the stairs to my apartment on the 3rd floor, my palms as clammy as the cold post-hurricane weather outside, wondering what I'd find. Wrestling open the lock, I saw we were fine. No damage, nothing broken, just no power or gas of any kind. I inhaled all the oxygen in the room and breathed it back out again. My new home was fine. A little dark and cold, but technically fine. Still, it felt different. Like the air here had changed, like all of the Alphabet City I thought I was starting to really know was now in a twilight zone, dropped into a vortex, a parallel universe, where everything was cold and sad and not every door could be wrenched open. As relieved as I was that I'd eventually be able to come back here, I knew that it wasn't quite the same, that I hadn't ever been brought back to the post-college bliss I thought I'd begun to create for myself. Like the woman getting married, something had changed my plans for me, and I didn't get a do-over. I didn't get to do over the fact that the New York I thought I knew never really existed at all, and the reality I had signed up for had changed yet again. New York wasn't defeated, but it also wasn't invincible. It was a city that could be bruised and battered and half-drowned when you weren't paying attention, and it could even take you down with it. I packed clothes to bring it back up to 100th Street and cleaned our fridge full of rotting, stinking food, trying to stop my stupid, useless, lost crying. Then out of nowhere, I started to hear big band jazz playing. It was far away, but inching closer, growing louder and louder until it was oppressive, unable to be ignored. It came in through the windows, brassy and huge and deafening. Standing out on the fire escape, I watched New Orleans-style jazz band march by, trombones and trumpets and drums glinting in what little light could be found, everyone wearing I Love New York t-shirts, handing out water and snacks to those digging out the remains of our homes. Alphabet City was another planet from what it had been a week ago. This was not a static place, and I was not a static person. So I leaned out the window, and I listened, and I readied myself for the day I might feel at home again. Thanks, everyone.